Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is something you were never meant to hear. Kentucky, 1792. A family settles in the wilderness with nothing but rusted mining tools, inherited debt, and bloodlines already poisoned by iron dust and premature death. The Hartwells, on paper, they were simple frontier miners. But in truth, they became America's most disturbing genetic experiment, a family that turned their own blood into a laboratory. Imagine a ridge cabin fortified like a fortress, its cellar carved too deep, stretching into the hillside as if meant to hide more than food. Inside, the brothers Caleb, Silas, and Jeremiah recorded everything. Not harvests, not weather, but symptoms: skin discoloration, tremors, lung corrosion. They didn't just endure poison. They measured it, calculated it, fed it to themselves and to others like priests of some forgotten science. And here's the truth most people will never confront: the Hartwells weren't just miners. They were researchers in a field no university dared touch: systematic human poisoning. What they discovered in those tunnels would ripple through generations, twisting their descendants into something unrecognizable. But before we descend any deeper, I need to know who's listening. Comment below where you're watching from, because history changes shape when we confront it together. And if you're the kind of person who can face truths buried under centuries of silence, hit subscribe. This is not entertainment. This is initiation. The Hartwell family story is not just about copper veins and Kentucky wilderness. It is about control, the control of human biology, the control of death itself. They learned, generation by generation, that suffering could be timed, measured, and bent into knowledge, and knowledge in the wrong hands becomes power. When we peel back the layers of history, we often find corruption hiding behind flags, bloodlines, and holy books. But sometimes the rot is not in the institution. Sometimes it is in the family tree itself, and the Hartwells stand as America's most forbidden genealogy. A lineage bred not by love, but by experiment. Their journals whisper of methods that would not officially exist for another half-century. Their bodies became archives of pain, stored in bone marrow, and passed down like cursed scripture. You're about to see how a family rewrote evolution in their own blood. Now, tell me in the comments, the curse begins. Write it twice. Because after this, you won't be the same. The year was 1792, the very same year Kentucky joined the Union. A time of promise, of frontier expansion, of men carving empires out of wilderness. But while others dreamed of fertile land and free harvests, the Hartwells chose a different inheritance. They carried with them journals stained with coal dust, drawings of skeletal deformities, and crude anatomical notes passed down from their father and grandfather. These weren't the records of survival. They were instructions for corruption. The Hartwells did not stumble into misfortune. They pursued it. Caleb, the eldest, obsessed over copper yields and human efficiency with the precision of a man who saw no distinction between ore and flesh. Silas, the enforcer, had once overseen miners back east, where labor efficiency meant stretching men past their breaking point. Jeremiah, the youngest, inherited not just the family journal but also a hunger to map the invisible veins of stone, of metal, and of blood. They arrived at the Copper Basin, a valley avoided by other settlers for one reason: the stone glowed green where the veins bled through, streaked with the poison of centuries. The locals warned them of sickness, of men whose skin turned the color of moss and whose eyes clouded like tarnished mirrors. But warnings meant nothing. To the Hartwells, the isolation was perfect. Silence made the best laboratory. Their first shaft struck copper so pure it defied reason. The assays were unanimous. This was wealth beyond imagination. But beneath that brilliance lay a secret mixture: arsenic, lead, and mercury bound into the metal like veins of venom. To touch it was to invite disease. To mine it was to invite death. And yet, to study it was to unlock power no one else dared claim. This is where the Hartwells began to shift from miners to something darker. They built ledgers not just of ore weight, but of pulse rates. They measured tremors as carefully as they measured copper tonnage. Each cough became data, each spasm an observation. Jeremiah himself volunteered, exposing his body as the first controlled subject. His handwriting remains clinical. Day 12, tremors worsening, appetite diminished. Note similarities with father's decline. These were not cries for help. They were blueprints for the next stage. And so, what began as mining soon became something else entirely. A family laboratory hidden in the Kentucky hills. A place where wealth and science fused with cruelty, and where the line between human and experiment no longer existed. Winter fell hard across Kentucky in 1794, and with it came the first undeniable sign of what the Hartwells were truly doing. Jeremiah, the youngest, the most reckless, emerged from the mine with hands blotched in strange green patches, skin mottled like something already half buried. His brothers saw it not with fear, but with fascination. Where others would have sought healing, they saw data. His lungs rasped at night, his handwriting shook, his muscles spasmed in predictable rhythms. Caleb noted it all with the cold devotion of a man dissecting his own bloodline. They had grown up in a family where death was never accidental. Their father had cataloged which workers in Pennsylvania's mines could last longest before collapsing, which herbs slowed the poisoning, and which conditions accelerated it. The Hartwells inherited more than tools. They inherited an obsession. And Jeremiah, whether knowingly or not, became their first sacrificial text. In February of 1795, Dr. Marcus Pendleton, one of the few physicians on the frontier, made the 3-day ride to examine him. His private notes survive to this day, hidden for decades in a Louisville archive. They describe Jeremiah's skin as discolored, his eyes clouded, his mind strangely sharp even as his body unraveled. Pendleton wrote, "This is not disease, this is control. Exposure is too deliberate, too measured. They are not victims of poisoning, they are its students." What unsettled Pendleton most was Caleb's interrogation. Instead of asking about cures, Caleb demanded to know what damage could never be reversed. He pressed the doctor about permanence, about whether Jeremiah's condition could be carried through the blood into future generations. When told that yes, the effects could scar a lineage, Caleb smiled. Pendleton later admitted he left their cabin shaken, convinced he had met men who valued knowledge over kinship, and who saw their own blood as clay for a darker design. Weeks later, Jeremiah collapsed in the depths of the shaft, spasms twisting his body into a grotesque performance. His brothers did not rush him to help. They recorded, they timed, they observed. His final words, scrawled in the journal as his vision narrowed, read, "Recommend shorter exposures for extended survival." They buried him beneath the ridge, but not before Caleb performed a crude autopsy, cutting into his own brother with the steady hand of a man convinced he was writing scripture. Jeremiah's death was not an end. It was the beginning of a family experiment that would stretch across generations, a curse hidden inside the veins of their blood. After Jeremiah's death, the Hartwells should have stopped. Any other family would have closed the shaft, abandoned the claim, and fled from the sickness creeping through their blood. But not them. For Caleb and Silas, Jeremiah was not a tragedy. He was proof that suffering could be timed, documented, and used. His body was no longer their brother. It was data carved into flesh. From that point forward, the Hartwell operation became something new. Every miner they hired disappeared within weeks. Hired hands came in desperate for pay, but never left. Their names never appeared in town ledgers. No graves marked their passing. Instead, their final hours were written into journals filled with charts and observations. How many days until the tremors began? How long until their lungs collapsed? How precisely the discoloration spread across their veins? And here lies the truth. The Hartwells were not just poisoning themselves. They were cultivating victims. Using the poor, the desperate, the forgotten as experiments in a frontier wilderness where no sheriff came looking. Kentucky law could not reach this far, and so silence became their accomplice. But their silence was never absolute, because traces of their obsession bled outward. Caleb sent letters to suppliers in Louisville, requesting tools that wouldn't exist in American mines for decades. Silas ordered herbs and tinctures known to slow the effects of mercury exposure. Their handwriting, elegant, deliberate, revealed not uneducated miners, but men who had studied enough anatomy and chemistry to rival the early physicians of Europe. Men who shouldn't have known these things. Men who weren't supposed to. Think about this: in 1796, America was still fumbling through its infancy, yet here in the wilderness of Kentucky, a family was conducting systematic human experiments on toxicity and inheritance. The kind of research universities would not even whisper of until the 19th century, and they did it alone. in secret, in blood. Now I ask you, if you're listening this far, you've already begun your own descent. Prove it. In the comments, type these words twice. I do not look away. That phrase marks you as someone who chooses the dangerous truth over the comfortable lie. Let it brand your mind the way the Hartwells branded their lineage. Because, as you will see, the Hartwells weren't just changing themselves. They were rewriting the human script, one poisoned vein at a time. By 1797, the surviving Hartwell brothers were no longer just miners. They had become curators of suffering, archivists of decay. But then, in their endless digging, they uncovered something that would shift their obsession into a new dimension. It began with the discovery of tools. Crude stone chisels, half-broken hammers, and gallery shafts that stretched deep into the earth, carved with primitive precision. At first, Caleb thought they had stumbled upon the remains of a forgotten indigenous mine, but the truth revealed itself in fragments of bone scattered across the tunnels. Bones discolored by the same green corrosion, now spreading through their own veins. The Hartwells realized they were not the first. Generations before them, others had labored here, driven by the same hunger, undone by the same poison. But while most skeletons bore the twisted marks of collapse, a few were different. A few showed evidence of something darker: survival. One skeleton, nearly complete, bore signs of prolonged exposure: green, stained ribs, brittle joints, but bones thickened unnaturally, as if the body had fought to adapt. Caleb studied it with almost religious awe. Here was proof that human flesh could endure the corruption if forced to. That survival was possible, but only through suffering. Silas called it providence. Caleb called it design. They both saw in those ancient remains a mirror of their own ambitions. What others called sickness, they began to call transformation. From that moment, their journals shifted. No longer simple observations of symptoms, but theories of inheritance, breeding, and adaptation. Could exposure be passed through the bloodline? Could they create descendants capable of surviving what killed Jeremiah? Could the Hartwell family itself become something new, something designed by poison? Their experiments intensified. New workers were lured to the mine with promises of wages. None returned. Their disappearances barely stirred whispers in the frontier chaos of Kentucky. For each new subject, Caleb documented every stage of decay as if writing scripture. Silas enforced order, ensuring no man escaped before the records were complete. And in the shadows of the tunnels, among bones, both ancient and recent, the brothers began to see themselves not as miners, not even as men, but as architects of a forbidden lineage. The Hartwell family was no longer digging copper. They were digging a new kind of human. After discovering the ancient remains, Caleb and Silas crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. What began with strangers, miners hired and discarded, now turned inward. The Hartwells decided their own lineage would become the vessel for this forbidden experiment. Caleb reasoned that copper and poison had already chosen them. Their grandfather Ezekiel had died coughing metal dust. Their father Tobias had mapped symptoms on scraps of parchment. Jeremiah had willingly given his body to the cause. Why stop now? Why not embrace the curse as a blueprint? And so the brothers began cultivating their family like a crop. Marriages were arranged not for love, but for control. Caleb studied bloodlines like an alchemist, selecting women from families with histories of resilience, those who had survived plagues, stillbirths, deformities. He claimed them not as wives, but as vessels. What followed were unions that produced children marked from birth. Infants with trembling hands, toddlers with bluish veins visible beneath pale skin. Some did not survive infancy. Those that did became subjects. Caleb noted their milestones with clinical detachment. Child breathes heavily at night. Observe for lung strength. Skin discoloration appears earlier than expected. Subject shows resistance to fever compared to siblings. They were not children. They were phases in a design. Silas, brutal and practical, oversaw the physical conditioning. He believed endurance could be forced through labor, through hardship. The children of the Hartwells worked the mine before they could write their names, breathing toxins that should have killed them, carrying loads that bent their spines. Those who broke were discarded into unmarked graves beside Jeremiah. Those who endured were elevated, pushed further into the experiment. Whispers spread among nearby settlers. Strange children glimpsed at dusk with yellowing eyes, silent and watchful. Women who went to live with the Hartwells vanished into the mind's silence. No lawman ventured close, for the Hartwell claim had become a place of dread, a fortress of secrecy. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Hartwell family was no longer a family at all. It was a controlled breeding experiment, generation by generation twisting itself toward something new. Something built to survive what no other could. They were no longer asking how to endure the poison. They were asking how to become it. By 1805, whispers of the Hartwell claim began to drift beyond the ridge. Neighbors spoke of smoke that rose at odd hours, the sound of hammering deep into the night, and children who should have been playing in fields, instead moving in lines like workers, silent, obedient, half-shadow. Few dared approach, but those who did came back unsettled, speaking of a family that no longer felt human. The county clerk noted something strange. While most mining families bought supplies, nails, wood, cloth, medicines, the Hartwells requested only the barest necessities: flour, salt, whiskey. Everything else they built themselves. They lived in isolation as if separation were their shield. But secrecy breeds suspicion. In 1811, a land surveyor named Samuel Crawford rode into the Copper Basin to map boundaries for Jefferson County. What he found disturbed him enough to record details in his private journal, details never meant for official eyes. He wrote of passing through the Hartwell clearing, where children with pale, blotched skin watched from behind narrow windows. He saw copper stacked in crates, its purity astonishing, its volume impossible for so few men to produce, and most unsettling of all, he counted fresh graves marked by nothing but crude stones, dozens of them, dotting the hillside like a field of silence. When Crawford asked Caleb about the graves, he was told curtly that disease had taken hired men, but the clerk in Louisville later remarked, no death records had been filed, no funerals recorded, no families ever claimed the bodies. It was as though the Hartwells had buried not people, but evidence, and yet, for all the suspicion, no action was taken. Why? Because their copper flowed into the veins of America's growth. Ships in New Orleans carried it south. Blacksmiths in Louisville forged it into tools. The nation profited from their poison, and so the silence of officials became complicity. But the real horror was not in the graves, nor in the children staring from behind glass. It was in the journals Caleb kept, hidden beneath floorboards. There he wrote not of wealth, but of progress. Generation 2, greater resistance observed. Less coughing, skin discoloration onset accelerated but manageable. Recommend further exposure. The Hartwells were not miners serving the frontier. They were engineers of blood, using their own descendants as prototypes. What the surveyor saw in those pale, quiet children was not weakness. It was the beginning of a design. By the second decade of the 1800s, the Hartwells had become a myth whispered across Kentucky's frontier. Farmers warned their children not to wander near the Copper Basin. Preachers spoke of them as if they were a parable, a family cursed for tampering with God's order. Yet no one intervened, no sheriff, no judge, no church elder. The Hartwells endured because fear built a wall higher than any court could. And here's where you, the listener, must pause. If you've made it this far, I want to test you again, because this is where the story begins to split. On one side is the comfortable version, the one you can close this video and forget, telling yourself it was just another strange family swallowed by time. But the other side is different. It's the side where you choose to know what others refuse to see. So here's the mark in the comments. Type, "I choose the darker side." That phrase tells me, and everyone watching, that you've already crossed the threshold. You're ready for the truths hidden in the journals and graves that no history book ever carried. Because the Hartwells were not merely a family anymore. By 1820, they had become something closer to a sect. Caleb, the intellectual patriarch, crafted doctrine out of poison and survival. Silas, the enforcer, made obedience absolute. Together they ruled their children not as sons and daughters, but as disciples. Inside the mine, experiments escalated. The journals describe methods almost surgical in precision, bleeding out veins to track discoloration, forcing inhalation of powdered copper to accelerate adaptation, even deliberate starvation to test which bodies could endure longest before collapse. None of this was recorded in the public ledgers of Kentucky. But deep in the Hartwell vault, Page after page documented a science no university dared attempt. And still, the children lived. Pale, trembling, with strange eyes that seemed to glint metallic in the lamplight. To outsiders, they looked sickly. But to Caleb, they were evidence, proof that the family was inching closer to transformation. The Hartwells no longer saw themselves as cursed. They saw themselves as chosen. By 1825, the first generation of Hartwell-born subjects had reached adulthood. They were no longer frail children coughing in the shadows. They had become something stranger, something the frontier could not explain. Neighbors told stories of Hartwell sons who could swing pickaxes from dawn until midnight without collapsing, of daughters who bore scars from burns and cuts that seemed to vanish within weeks. Yet, for every tale of endurance, there were darker whispers, mouths stained permanently green, eyes that reflected torchlight like an animal's, voices that echoed oddly in the mind's tunnels. One settler swore he saw a Hartwell boy standing barefoot in the snow, motionless, his skin pale as bone but unshivering. Another claimed that when a preacher tried to bless the family at a distance, the children erupted in a fit of laughter, as if mocking God himself. Caleb recorded these moments with feverish awe. His journals from those years read less like science and more like scripture. Subject recovered from lung collapse in less than 14 days. Veins resilient, no infection. Mark this as proof of inheritance. Silas, meanwhile, took a darker pride in their fearlessness. He trained them like soldiers, drilling them in silence, discipline, and loyalty to family above all. It was around this time that the Hartwells began practicing rituals. Caleb insisted they weren't rituals, but conditioning ceremonies. Yet to those few who witnessed fragments from a distance, it looked like worship. Children kneeling in the mine shafts, inhaling powdered copper until their lips turned blue. Mothers whispering lullabies that were really chants, promising that the poison in their veins was not a curse, but a crown. And then came the first death that could not be hidden. In 1827, a traveling peddler vanished near the Basin. Weeks later, his mule was found grazing on the outskirts of Hartwell land, its saddle stripped bare. No body was ever recovered. But the county clerk's notes, still preserved in archives, record the complaint of a settler who claimed to see Hartwell children dragging something heavy into the mine under the cover of moonlight. For decades, suspicions had been whispered. Now, for the first time, fear became evidence, and officials were forced to decide, confront the Hartwells or leave them to their darkness. By 1828, the whispers had become too loud to ignore. The missing peddler, the graves on the hillside, the strange children glimpsed through cracks in shuttered windows. Together they painted a picture the county could no longer dismiss. A small delegation was formed, 2 deputies, a preacher, and a surveyor tasked with documenting the Copper Basin. They rode out to the Hartwell claim under the pretense of a land dispute, but everyone knew the real purpose. They were going to look into the darkness. What they found was not the ramshackle chaos of a dying mining family. It was order. The mine mouth had been reinforced with timbers, the clearing swept clean, the copper crates stacked with military precision, and standing silently at the edge of the woods were the Hartwell children, not playing, not laughing, just watching. Eyes pale, unblinking, faces smudged with greenish dust. Deputy Rawlins wrote later that he felt as if he were trespassing on a kingdom that did not belong to men. When the preacher stepped forward to speak, Silas emerged from the shadows. His frame had thickened with age, but his presence carried the same brutality. He said nothing at first, just let the silence work, until even the deputies shifted uneasily. Finally, he gestured toward Caleb, who appeared with a book pressed to his chest, the family journals. Caleb welcomed them politely, almost warmly, insisting the Hartwells had nothing to hide. He spoke of copper yields, of sicknesses that had passed, of a family devoted to survival. But the preacher later swore that Caleb's eyes flicked to the children with pride, as though they were the true evidence, the living proof of his words. The delegation left uneasy but unharmed. Their official report spoke only of a reclusive but industrious family. But in the surveyor's private journal, hidden until his death, he wrote a single line that still chills. Those children are not cursed. They are becoming what the mine demands. The county chose silence once again. Copper meant progress, and progress demanded sacrifice. Better to ignore the strange evolution in the hills than disrupt the flow of wealth. And so the Hartwells were left untouched, allowed to continue their work in secret. But the children, the ones shaped by copper and cruelty, were no longer content to remain hidden. They were beginning to look outward. By the 1830s, the Hartwell mine no longer contained them. Their children, now grown pale-skinned and strangely resilient, started to appear in nearby settlements. Not often, and never for long, but just enough to leave an impression that spread like wildfire. A tavern keeper in Bardstown claimed a young man came in asking for whiskey. His speech was soft, deliberate, as if he was rehearsing every word. But when he drank, he did not cough or wince. He swallowed half a bottle without flinching, then set the glass down, unbroken. Before walking out into the night, a seamstress in Harrodsburg swore 2 Hartwell women came to her shop for fabric. She remembered their hands, veins dark and rope-like, fingertips stained as though dipped in acid. The women asked for no patterns, no colors, only black cloth. She said when they left, the shop smelled faintly metallic, like blood struck on iron, and then came the disappearances. First a farmhand, then a trapper, then a child, always near the roats that brushed too close to the copper basin. Some were found later, bodies oddly preserved, skin mottled green, as though they had been changed before death. Others were never found at all. Officials refused to confront it. Copper shipments still came. Money still moved. But locals whispered the truth out loud now. The Hartwells were no longer hiding. They were testing the world beyond their mine. Caleb's journals from this period, recovered decades later, show a disturbing shift. He no longer referred to his descendants as subjects. Instead, he used the word generation. Generation 3 demonstrates greater immunity to fever. Muscle endurance exceeds control samples. Migration into settlements necessary for behavioral observation. It was not illness. It was intention. The Hartwells were breeding themselves into something stronger, and the frontier was their laboratory. But when the outside world finally pushed back, it was not with courts or lawmen. It came from something far more dangerous: vengeance. Families of the missing began to gather, whispering of torches, of rifles, of ending the Hartwell line once and for all. And the Hartwells were waiting for it. In the winter of 1833, patience snapped. The missing farmhands, the vanishing children, the whispers of strange figures watching from the tree line. It was no longer enough to pray or file complaints. A group of men, mostly farmers and hunters, gathered in secret. They brought rifles, axes, and kerosene. They called themselves a posse, but what they really were was a mob. Their plan was simple: march into the copper basin, burn out the Hartwells, and bury their legacy under ash. But when they arrived, they found something chilling. The Hartwells were waiting for them. Not cowering, not pleading, waiting. Witness accounts are fractured, but certain details remain consistent. The Hartwell men emerged from the mine like soldiers, their movements perfectly in sync, their pale skin streaked with copper dust. The women stood behind them, silent, clutching their children, whose eyes reflected torchlight unnaturally bright. The mob shouted accusations: murder, witchcraft, blasphemy. Caleb Hartwell stepped forward, holding his journal, and spoke calmly. "We are not cursed. We are chosen. You came to kill us, but you are too late. The mine has already made us more than you." The first shot rang out before he finished, and then chaos exploded. The mob surged, torches waving, guns firing. But what followed was not the easy slaughter they expected. Hartwell bodies absorbed bullets with terrifying endurance. Some stumbled, but rose again. Others fought with unnatural strength, tearing rifles from men's hands, striking with precision as if every motion had been rehearsed. One survivor swore he saw a Hartwell boy, no older than 12, seize a grown man by the throat and lift him clean off the ground, holding him there until his face turned black. Another claimed a Hartwell woman walked through fire without screaming, her clothes aflame, until she dragged a man into the blaze with her. When dawn came, the mob was broken. Half were dead, the rest scattered. And the Hartwells, they had lost some of their own, but they had proven something greater. They could not be erased by ordinary men. From that day forward, the Copper Basin was abandoned. No settler, no preacher, no sheriff dared return. The Hartwells had become untouchable, their mine a kingdom sealed off from the world. But silence is never permanent. Legend spread, And with every telling, the Hartwells grew less like humans and more like something else. After the failed purge of 1833, the Copper Basin became a scar on the map. Travelers were warned to steer clear. Children were hushed when they asked about the smoke that sometimes rose from the hills. And locals coined a phrase whispered in taverns, "Don't wander too close to Hartwell land." The family was no longer seen in daylight, yet stories of them multiplied. They became less flesh and blood and more myth, bending with each telling. Some said their skin had turned entirely green from copper, their veins shining like metal wires beneath translucent flesh. Others claimed the Hartwells had stopped aging, their patriarchs and matriarchs walking the hills for decades without a wrinkle. A miner's widow swore she saw the same Hartwell boy at her husband's funeral in 1822 and again in 1840 unchanged. Campfire tales painted them as spirits that walked the forests at night, their breath leaving trails of mist that poisoned crops. Children dared each other to place copper coins at the edge of the basin and return at dawn to see them blackened, as though something had drawn out their purity overnight. But buried beneath the superstition were details too consistent to dismiss. Traders traveling at dusk spoke of pale figures watching from tree lines, their eyes reflecting lantern light like glass. Hunters who ventured too close reported hearing chanting carried on the wind, low and rhythmic, echoing from deep within the mine shafts. And in the county records of 1847, there appears a chilling note from a sheriff who dared to investigate a missing cattle herd. "We found the bones picked clean, arranged in a circle, ribs pointing outward like a sun. No predator does this. The Hartwells were here." By mid-century, the Hartwells had become what they always wanted: untouchable. Not by law, not by mobs, not even by God. Their name was no longer just a family, it was a warning. But deep inside the basin, Caleb Hartwell's journals show something even darker. The family was not retreating into myth. They were preparing. Generation 5 complete. Adaptation is accelerating. Soon we will no longer need the mine. The Hartwells were not fading. They were evolving, and the world had no idea what was coming. By the 1850s, the Copper Basin was no longer enough to contain them. Caleb's descendants, Generation 5, had grown restless. They were stronger now, their endurance uncanny, their appearance still human but not quite. It began subtly. A Hartwell boy was spotted working on a riverboat crew along the Ohio. He spoke little, ate even less, but carried crates twice the weight of other men without strain. When asked where he came from, he simply said, "The Basin." Weeks later, the boat's captain disappeared mid-voyage. The crew claimed the boy never left his post at the ropes, but his eyes followed them with a cold, knowing calm. In Lexington, a traveling doctor recorded the arrival of 2 Hartwell women seeking supplies. He noted their skin had a faint green sheen in lamplight and that they insisted on jars of mercury and powdered minerals no physician would ever prescribe. When questioned, one smiled and replied, "We know what cures us. Your medicine is too weak." And then the journals, Caleb's legacy, still kept meticulously by each generation, began recording expeditions outside the basin. Phrases like, "Subject 12 inserted into town life, responses favorable. Exposure to outsiders has produced no detection. Integration possible." They were testing infiltration. Folklore twisted further. Now, parents in Kentucky warned their children, if a pale stranger came offering sweets, never take them. If a family moved into town and bought only salt, copper, or black cloth, beware. They said the Hartwells could pass as ordinary folk until night fell, when their voices grew hollow and their eyes caught the moon like glass. By 1857, rumors spread of entire cabins found abandoned, doors locked from the inside, meals still warm on tables, but no trace of the families who lived there. People whispered the Hartwells had begun harvesting more than copper. And yet, official records remain silent. Not a sheriff's report, not a preacher's sermon, not a single formal investigation. Why? Because copper still flowed out of the basin, bought by rail companies, telegraph builders, and arms manufacturers. Industry turned its head, as industry always does. The Hartwells had stepped into the wider world, and they had done so under a veil of silence purchased by profit, but they weren't wandering blindly. According to one final journal entry, before the Civil War erupted, Generation 6 will no longer hide. The world itself will become our basin. The Civil War was a feast for the Hartwells. While the nation tore itself apart, the family moved silently through the smoke and blood. Soldiers vanished from encampments without a trace, their muskets left behind, their boots neatly placed as if they had walked willingly into the dark. Union officers in Kentucky wrote of deserters who left camp only to reappear weeks later, stronger, quieter, and utterly obedient to strange new leaders. Confederate diaries mention green-eyed men who offered water from blackened canteens. Those who drank were said to fall ill, wasting away while the stranger looked on, smiling faintly. Battlefields provided more than chaos. They provided cover. Mass graves swallowed missing men, their absences explained by war instead of something far older. Families assumed their sons were lost to gunfire or disease. No one thought to ask if the Hartwells had claimed them. And the copper, the war consumed it. Telegraph wires, bullets, cannon fittings, all demanded metal. The Hartwells became suppliers, their ore smuggled out through contractors who never questioned the hands that loaded their wagons. Money flowed in, secrecy remained intact, but in their journals the family's true harvest was recorded. Prison camps ideal for collection. Disease provides excuse, no suspicion. Exposure to blood-soaked soil accelerates the change. The earth itself accepts us. In one entry from 1864, a chilling revelation, we have tested on outsiders. They take longer, but they adapt. Soon we need not rely on bloodlines. Soon, all may become Hartwell. Folklore from the era whispers of regiments that marched at night without orders, their eyes reflecting moonlight, their footsteps perfectly synchronized. Towns spoke of soldiers who returned home after the war, but their families swore they weren't the same. They ate little, spoke less, and never seemed to sleep. By the war's end, the Copper Basin was no longer an isolated kingdom. It was a hive, with tendrils stretching through Kentucky and beyond. And yet the family remained nameless in history books. Their presence erased, their journals hidden, their influence mistaken for the ordinary horrors of war. But Caleb's descendants had achieved something profound. They had taken a conflict that nearly destroyed America and used it to seed themselves across the land. The Hartwells were no longer a family, they were becoming a nation. The Civil War had broken the country in two, but when the smoke cleared, the Hartwells were stronger than ever. Railroads stretched across the land, telegraph wires hummed with unseen voices, and copper, their copper, ran through it all like blood through veins. The Basin no longer confined them. Every mile of wire, every spike driven into a rail, was another thread in their web. Workers along the lines whispered of men who never slept, who lifted steel rails alone, their hands bleeding green when cut. Telegraph operators claimed the wires sometimes carried more than messages. Voices muttering in languages no one recognized, words that tasted like iron when spoken aloud. Most dismissed it as fatigue, fever, or fear. But in the Hartwell journals, the truth was recorded in a single phrase: we are no longer bound to the Basin. The nation itself is our body. And so the family dissolved into history, nameless and faceless, their bloodlines hidden in plain sight. They became miners, railmen, factory workers, merchants. They walked unnoticed through towns and cities, passing among us, always watching, always waiting. The folklore remains. Warnings whispered in Appalachia, in Kansas, in Texas: never follow the sound of static in the wires. Never take food from a stranger whose eyes catch the moon like glass. And if a pale man offers you copper, refuse it. Because some say the Hartwells never died. They didn't vanish into the past. They became the current in the wires above your head, the hum in your walls, the shimmer in the streetlight outside your window. And if you listen closely, right now, in the silence, you might hear them.